I'm Saul Gellerman. This is the first of two films about the work of Douglas McGregor, a man whose impact upon management has probably been more profound and more far-reaching than that of any behavioral scientist of his time. Douglas McGregor died in October 1964 at the age of 58. He was then professor of industrial management at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In this first film, we're going to try to clarify McGregor's famous distinction between theory X and theory Y. We're going to ask two of his closest associates, Warren Bennis and Richard Beckhard, to help explain this to us, and we'll also try to use a small dramatic illustration to show what McGregor had in mind. McGregor, at one time in his career, was a top executive himself, and yet he always insisted upon the importance to management of assumptions. He once said that every managerial act rests on a theory, and that the critical difference between effective and ineffective management did not lie so much in the administrative practices of a company, but rather in assumptions which managers made about the process of management and about people in general.
I think it's important to say first that The Human Side of Enterprise was McGregor's first book, which he wrote after many, many years of consulting and research and teaching in industrial organization. And to bring coherence to his own experience, to his own teaching, and I think also to clarify thoughts in his own mind, he came upon this notion of talking about attitudes or assumptions or expectations in terms of an XY distinction.
This is Warren Bennis. He is academic vice president of the State University of New York at Buffalo.
His life. And by a theory X and a theory Y, he had in mind a certain set of expectations, of values that management has towards workers and toward each other. And not only values that they themselves hold and act on, but values that cause certain reactions to them on the part of other people. So theory X and theory Y, to start with, is a framework of thinking about people, and a framework upon which you expect other people to behave towards you.
Warren, why did he use these terms X and Y instead of something which would indicate some kind of value judgment?
Well, I wasn't there when he actually wrote the paper, but my guess is he wanted to use the most neutral and sanitary terms he could so as to not turn people off. And rather than calling one, quote, good or bad, or another certain kind of evaluative name which clearly connotes a certain bias, I think he wanted to talk about these as neutrally, in as detached point of view as he could. And that's likely the basic reason why he chose these letters rather than calling them certain kinds of names.
Warren, when McGregor spoke of these X and Y assumptions, how did he develop these ideas? I mean, where did it come from?
If you look at almost any piece of writing in the area of work and man, or factory management, or leadership, or motivation, there is always implied, if you look closely enough, a set of notions about man and what kind of person he is and how he's motivated and guided and controlled and directed. I think McGregor felt it was very natural to want to work, that man's motivation primarily stems from within, from internal desires, from wanting to master something, to feel competent in something, and not something which he is motivated towards by certain external rewards. You know, one of the first lectures I ever attended by Doug was where he put carrot and the stick theory of motivation on the blackboard. And this is exactly the opposite of what a theory Y orientation would be, which essentially is that man must be motivated by his self-control. People work not because they're being pushed by rewards or punishments or by a good paternalistic boss or by being bargained into it, but essentially that the peak, the height of work experience comes out of being self-motivated because man wants to do a good job. Another very basic assumption is that the theory Y manager can apply a broad range of behavior to any particular human problem, that he can be quite flexible in his approach to human beings and problems. But he doesn't operate from a fixed, rigid point of view about what appropriate managerial behavior is. And essentially what I'm getting at is a question of choice. If I had to summarize in a couple of words or a couple of sentences what a theory-Y orientation would be. It's a certain assumption of man which basically has a belief in man's need to grow and to develop and the implications of work in this development. And secondly, a theory of choice, of developing the widest range of possibilities of behavior, the widest repertory in which to respond to human situations.
Theory Y says, in effect, that man is perfectible, although not necessarily perfect. Would that be?
I think I would rather put it in terms of that man is a growing, learning animal, and that he moves toward a certain, is committed towards growth.
Well, how would you contrast that with the Theory X assumptions?
Well, Theory X takes a view of man that I think you can see all over the place. It says that basically man is passive, inert. In order to really get that instrument or material to really get to work, you have to seduce that person, you have to woo him, you have to use, if that doesn't work, you then use other kinds of influence measures like bargaining with him, or bribing him, or basically using all kinds of blandishments. And finally, if all of those don't work, you say, okay, damn it, I'll kick you. I think the basis of McGregor's ideas is tied in with the theory of influence, a theory of power, of how you get people to do things. And McGregor was essentially saying that if you give people a chance, if you develop a kind of a human environment which is collaborative and non-competitive, where you confront conflict directly, where you have the belief that man intrinsically, internally, gets a bang out of being competent, then you don't have to push, coerce, bargain, blandish, woo, or persuade anybody.
Look, Lou, Snell's due to arrive here any minute. Is there any way you can get that report into me? Yeah, I know you got a lot of work to do, but you know these guys from the main office. They've got computers for hearts. Yeah. Well, okay, if you don't want to put the overtime in on it, but look, get it to me as soon as possible, huh? Look, Lou, Snell's here. Look, I'll call you back later. And look, in the future, okay, yeah. Matt, how are you? Long time no see.
Oliver, good to see you again. You're looking well.
Well, I can't complain. Well, just sit down and have some coffee, huh?
Fine.
And 2 coffees, huh?
Black, please.
Yeah, both black. Matt, we run a quality shop here. Everyone down here is a pretty smart cookie. And we make the best product in the business.
Sure you do.
Oh, thank you, man. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Sure you do, but you also only make 5% on your gross. You've been making the same product for 5 years, and you've still got the same percentage of the market.
Damn it, Matt. This is not a mass production factory.
I know that, Oliver. But we feel that you could be doing much better. And your own statistics back us up.
Well, what do statistics tell you about morale and loyalty? I bet we have the best satisfied employees in the business. And how do you put that down on paper?
Through increased productivity. And you don't have it. Listen, Oliver, I want to be very frank with you. The main office has sent me down here to have a good, hard look at your operation. They feel, and I agree with them, that you've got to do one of 2 things, or maybe both. You've got to get rid of the deadwood, and you've got to reorganize.
Look, Matt, before you go any further, let's take a look at the plant.
I would like to do that.
What's the problem, Frank?
Oh, there's no problem, Mr. Simpson. It's just routine maintenance.
Good.
Tell me, do you usually do your regular checkups during the working day?
Well, the men don't like to work at night, and I can't say that I blame them.
Look at that intensive heat, Matt.
This is probably one of the best diffusion processes in the whole country.
I'd have to agree, Oliver. It's an excellent setup.
And it's getting better all the time. Look, I got something else to show you right over here. We're working all the time.
Mr. Simpson?
Yeah.
Mr. Simpson, I don't want to interrupt you now, but may I see you in your office later, sir?
Sure, Jerry. Look, there's somebody that I want you to meet. This is Matt Snell from the main office. Matt, this is Jerry Moran, one of our engineers.
How do you do?
How do you do, sir?
Hey, what's the trouble, Jerry? Why the gloomy face, huh?
The new diffusion system. All the devices we've made so far have shown bad reverse characteristics. I think it's something basic to the design concept, and I really don't know that much about it.
Want me to give it to somebody else?
Well, if it wouldn't be too much trouble, I think you'd get better results.
No trouble at all. Just leave a memo on my desk.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you. Oliver, if he can't do that job, why does he hold the position he does?
Well, he's got a lot of promise, Matt, and I don't want to discourage him. She's dropping the, there, pin goes in, you know, and the epoxy and so forth. And it's a matter not only of that. Now, Matt, there's someone I want you to meet over here. Trudy Reardon. Trudy, this is Matt Snell from the main office.
Pleasure, Mr. Snell.
How do you do, Miss Reardon?
Matt, Trudy's kind of what this company is all about. Her grandfather worked here. Her father worked here. Two brothers work here. And now Trudy's here.
And I have a cousin who's secretary to Mr. Michaels in bookkeeping.
And a cousin who works here.
Well, we seem to have been treating your family pretty well.
It's like working for my father, Mr. Snell. I can't tell you how good they've been to me. When my brother had that accident, the company lent us money to pay for the hospital. And my supervisor, she gave me time off during the day to go see him because of the visiting hours at the hospital. And when...
I think that Mr. Snell gets the message, Trudy.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's just that I'm so grateful to be working here.
Grateful. Now, did you hear that, Matt? Now, tell me honestly, how many times have you heard an employee of a plant say that they were grateful to be working there? And she isn't the only one. There are dozens just like her.
Yes, the morale's fine, Oliver. The product's fine. You're one of the best electronics men in the business. But you run this place like a country club.
Now, wait a minute.
Now, let me finish. Your maintenance men don't like to work at night. So you tie up your machines and your employees during the day for preventive maintenance. One of your engineers can't do his job. Do you fire him? No. Do you transfer him? No. You baby him and give the job to somebody else. You hire people on the basis of personal relationships instead of qualifications and let them come and go as they please.
Matt, this is a quality shop. This isn't a mass production factory. You can't regiment these kinds of employees.
These employees are like employees anywhere. They'll get away with as much as they can. They'll come in 15 minutes late, but will they stay 15 minutes later? Tell me frankly, do you think people would work at all if they really didn't think it was necessary?
I don't know, Matt. I don't know.
Well, I do know. Most people will do anything they can to avoid work. That's why you've got to organize their life for them. And as objectively as possible. Install controls, set up production standards. Evaluate your people regularly and let them know they're being watched. Those that won't fall into line, fire. Set an example. Don't be afraid to.
Matt, if I did half the things that you asked, this place would be in sheer chaos. You can't treat people like machines anymore. Anyhow, do you really expect that I would get the same sort of cooperation if I got tough with these people all of a sudden?
To install order doesn't mean you can't be nice to people. Listen, most employees appreciate discipline. The more structured the business is, the more secure they feel. Oh, I know, it'll be difficult at first. They'll grumble and rebel. But if you take the proper disciplinary action now, the rest of them will fall into line. And I promise you, your production figures will go up within a year.
It seems to me that if you're nice to people, you get better results than if you act like some kind of a tyrant or something. Now, I can't tell you how many times these employees have bent over backwards to meet a customer's order, just because I asked them to, Matt.
If you were better organized, you could probably make that delivery date without having to ask favors of your employees.
I believe in helping people because I feel that they need help, and my job is to give it to them. And in return, when I need help, they'll give it to me. And frankly, I can't think of any better way to run a plant.
I can't agree with you.
That little incident is a beautiful illustration of what is so frequently seen as theory Y management in Mr. Simpson's performance. One of the things that Doug McGregor was saying before he died was if he had to write the book over again, he'd certainly sharpen up that particular point about hard and soft management, because in the case of both these gentlemen, neither one of them are operating from theory Y assumptions. If we can start.
This is Richard Beckhard, a consultant who is senior lecturer in organizational behavior in the Sloan School of Management at MIT.
I think Mr. Snell, at least from what one could see in the film, is clearly theory X oriented in terms of we've got to get the job done, people are units of production, put in more controls and so forth. I think Mr. Simpson is operating from anarchy rather than from objectives. What he's doing is saying, let everybody do whatever they want to do, and they'll all be happy in their work. The problem is he'll fail, as the scene shows. That basically, the difference between both of these in theory Y is that nobody's operating against objectives for improvement.
Neither one of them was theory Y.
No, not in my opinion. Not at all.
In a sense,
They're
Mr.
almost
Simpson,
classic misuse, particularly of Simpson.
Mr. Simpson would have been just a different variation of theory X, really.
Yeah, he's operating on, it may be manipulative or it may be just nice guy, but either way the effect's the same. But he's trying to get him to do what he wants him to do through the human relations approach, that is get everybody loving everybody and you'll produce work, or let them do whatever they want to do. And that isn't where people are either. And that is not where theory Y assumptions are about. People have a need to achieve, a need to be moving towards something, a need to be getting somewhere, a need to have some collaborative ownership and participation in planning something. And what's happening here is people are operating all over the place as independents, and I suspect they're probably pretty tired when the day's over from all that good morale.
Well, Dick, if that was not the real theory Y, can you give me an example of what McGregor did mean by theory Y?
Yeah, McGregor meant, I'll try, McGregor meant that the assumptions about people, which neither of these gentlemen had, were that people aren't lazy, that people want to participate, that people have the capacity for self-direction, and so forth, that people can collaborate. Both of these men showed lack of confidence in the workers, but in different forms. Theory Y application, remember theory Y is a set of assumptions about people and organizations and management. It is not a set of behaviors. So one has to infer from the scene what the behavior, what the assumptions were. But the real theory Y assumptions would have had that, would in this case have had that group managing this particular business and this particular project against goals. There would be goals for the organization. There would be goals for the groups within the organization. Individuals would be collaborating with their supervisors in setting improvement targets. And let me try to put it in the context of that scene. I think if Simpson had been theory Y, he would have been operating the organization and he would have related to the various people that he related to on a basis of what are we trying to have ready for Snell? What kind of information do we need? Who's got what information? Let's see what's the best plan to really give him the picture.
Dick, if we did have a theory Y approach there, how would that mutual confidence have been attained?
Well, you hear a lot these days about trust, mutual trust, and so forth. And I find that an awful lot of energy being inappropriately used, in my opinion, with people talking about how can we learn to trust each other. I think you learn to trust each other in a working organization the way you learn to trust each other in the trenches. You do something together. You engage collaboratively in activities which show by the actions themselves that there is confidence and trust. Specifically, for example, Simpson could have used the resources in his organization and could have shown the trust in the various departments that they represented for them to provide major suggestions about how to work with Snell. He could have brought others in to talk with Snell. He could have raised questions, quite frankly, about what were the problems that Snell saw.
And how do we get there?
Well, the point is that people want to get there. People want to be on winning teams. People want to belong to something that's important. They want to be proud of what's happening in the outfit they work for. This goes right back again to the early assumptions. People want to feel that they're making a contribution to something that's important to them, whether it's economically important or socially important or whatever. And so many of the constraints and the policies and the practices that operate under a theory X set of assumptions suppress that, push it down. You don't have to do very much to let it out.
That's why we so rarely actually see this in a Theory X type of organization.
Right, because under Theory X, the issue is how do you cope with authority? How do you get ahead in the organization? You have to get ahead in a power way or a political way. How do you keep your nose clean? You keep your nose clean by playing it safe. What do you do if you're a good guy in the organization? You do what's required and maybe a little bit more, and you make sure you come to the proper people's attention and so forth. Now, these are exaggerations. Not all organizations operate entirely this way, but they're not very big exaggerations in terms of what organization life is like in most cases.
Well, these things make for a sort of a superficial harmony, but not very much productivity or growth.
Yeah, well, they make for a fair amount of productivity as long as the pressure is on, as long as the reward systems, the economic and other, are strong enough so that people say they will produce, as long as the contract is a fair day's work for fair day's pay sort of thing. But they don't reach the optimum productivity. They don't reach the optimum quality. You can get, for example, high productivity through force for a period of time. You can require people to produce, and ordinarily they will, for a period of time, either to get you off their back or to show you or because that's the name of the game or whatever. But in terms of other crucial variables like quality, in terms of long-range productivity and so forth, people's nature is such that they will rebel in one form or another, either withdrawing or fighting over a period of time if the organization operates from this base.
I think you can see that what Douglas McGregor had in mind when he spoke about Theory X and Theory Y was not simple at all. Actually, it was rather subtle. Further, McGregor did not invent Theory X or Theory Y. Rather, he discovered many managers actually operating under one of these sets of assumptions or the other. Of course, the real test of the significance of McGregor's discovery would lie in the results which organizations operating under one theory or the other could actually achieve. And in the second part of this film, we're going to try to show you some of the ways in which McGregor's thinking has actually been applied in industry. This is the second of two films about the work of Douglas McGregor. In this film, we're going to ask three of McGregor's closest associates, Warren Bennis, Richard Beckard, and John Paul Jones, to describe for us some of the ways in which McGregor's thinking has been applied to industry. Suppose we begin with one of McGregor's most important contributions, the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, by this, McGregor meant that the assumptions which a manager has about the capabilities of a subordinate will actually tend to define and limit what that subordinate can accomplish. So that, for example, if the manager begins with the notion that this man is untrustworthy and irresponsible, he's much more likely to behave irresponsibly. And, on the other hand, if the manager assumes that this man can be trusted, that he is, in fact, more likely to behave in a responsible manner under those assumptions. Well, suppose we now ask Warren Bennis to describe, from his own experience, an example of one of these self-fulfilling prophecies.
The best way of describing it comes from an experience I had in industry when I was doing some consulting with a small electronics plant. It was you might call it a Theory X plant. Autocratic, great deal of surveillance of the worker to make sure he wasn't deviating from certain kinds of norms, a repressive atmosphere, a place where the most creative activity of the workers went into beating the system. In this particular place, they did a lot of time and motion studies and cost analyses and so on, and they discovered that from 10:30 to 11 every day, the productivity curves dipped very dramatically downward. And then they came to an interesting conclusion, that between 10:30 and 11, in this particular plant, all the foremen took a coffee break and had their own meeting, which left the workers unattended to and by themselves. And of course, the workers usually during 10:30 and 11 were clowning and playing and doing all kinds of things. And they said, you see, you give them a half hour off away from our scrutiny and they begin doing the same old things again, i.e. being lazy, goofing off, and not doing the work. And then they said, let's go back and make sure that we have someone looking at those people all the time. Now, this is a beautiful example of a certain set of assumptions or expectations about how people behave, which in fact brings about the very behavior which you're forecasting and predicting.
The effect of an assumption is to use your experience in such a way that life doesn't teach you anything. You keep on being confirmed in what you already think is true.
Right. That's right. I think that's another aspect of it. It's a programmed, rigid way of looking at individuals and people.
Are you suggesting that if the supervisors had a different set of assumptions, that this behavior wouldn't have occurred during the coffee break?
Partly, and I think this is where the complexity comes in. I suspect that there will always be a certain proportion of people who will respond only to rather harsh, even dictatorial kinds of leadership styles. And though I myself have rarely seen people who couldn't change and grow away from that. But basically, if we approach people with a certain set of assumptions, namely, if you make the assumption or have the expectation that people really want to get satisfaction from their work, and that the main incentive for work grows out of their own internal notions of craftsmanship or mastery or satisfaction, I think these set of expectations will also be transmitted to people and will, over the long run, respond to them.
Right there, when you said that some people have to be coerced in order to get work out of them, aren't you voicing a Theory X assumption yourself?
Well, this is what I meant earlier, and I'm delighted you raised that, because first off, a Theory Y manager tries to confront and face facts, but there are some people, given their own circumstances and possibly the technology or the job they're involved in, may never in fact get unhinged enough or free enough or comfortable enough to make these, to use their own internal motivation to work. And what I'm getting at is I suppose there are some people, Saul, who all of their lives need this continual prodding, the continual stick, or the carrot to do anything. And the significant thing here is that you have a variety of responses to people. And you don't use a Theory Y notion rigidly. I mean, I think what I was getting at here is that a Theory Y means anything. It means a way of looking at people and being able to respond flexibly to where they are and to not what you think they ought to be like.
Theory Y is almost an assumption-less approach to management, isn't it? It demands that instead of assuming what people are like, that you find out from direct experience with them.
I think that's I like that, because a good deal of McGregor's later works had to do with developing the kinds of workplaces, settings, environments that would lead to the practical means and methods for moving from a Theory X environment to a Theory Y environment. But it was based, his whole theory of education was based on experienced behavior. and not on assumptions that we make. So I think you're dead right that one could say, though I've been defining theory X, theory Y as a set of assumptions or a set of beliefs or expectations, that in fact you might say that other than certain underlying values, as the ones I mentioned earlier, like man is a growing, learning animal, that basically you start with the experience from the man and build from there.
Now, before we ask Dick Beckhard to relate some of his experiences in applying Theory Y, let's flash back briefly to that scene from the previous film in which two managers had very different managerial styles, and yet neither one of them was really using Theory Y assumptions. Both of these styles were most likely to result in a self-fulfilling prophecy of Theory X, and neither was likely to liberate the potentialities of the people to whom they were applied.
Matt, this is a quality shop. This is not a mass production factory. You can't regiment this type of employee.
No. Most people will do anything they can to avoid work. That's why you've got to organize their life for them. Install controls, set up production standards. Evaluate your people regularly and let them know they're being watched. Those that won't fall into line, fire. Set an example. Don't be afraid to.
Matt, if I did half the things that you asked, this place would be in sheer chaos. You can't treat people like machines anymore. Anyhow, do you really expect that if I got tough with these people all of a sudden, I'd still get the cooperation that I do now?
To install order doesn't mean you can't be nice to people. Listen, most employees appreciate discipline. The more disciplined the business is, the more secure they feel. Well, I know it'll be tough for a while. They'll grumble and they'll rebel. But if you take the proper disciplinary action now, the rest of them will fall into line. And I promise you that your production will go up within the year.
It seems to me that if you're nice to people, you get better results than if you act like some kind of a tyrant.
If one operates under the traditional assumptions of man being basically a lazy animal, that just isn't true. There's a lot of evidence that man is not basically a lazy animal, but he may act lazily if the conditions in which he's operating or working are such that produce lazy behavior. One of the things that it seems to me McGregor was saying was that, isn't it a shame that in terms of managerial strategies and managerial tactics, we're not using the knowledge the way we use it in the physical sciences? For example, in the physical sciences, a sort of basic assumption about the use of science is to adapt to nature. And you organize things on the notion that water doesn't run uphill, so then you have to cope with that. But in a lot of the ways we've been managing, and based on in the social area, we're managing in ways that would assume that the human water runs uphill, as it were. Let me just try to illustrate this. In a large automobile plant and an assembly line, there's one small group that I know of that meets once a month for about a half an hour to set quality improvement targets for themselves for the next month.
These are just workers.
These are just workers, yeah. And this particular group is producing about 20% better quality on the average than groups in the same building right next door to them, all around them, composed of the same kinds of people. Now, that can't be an accident, and I could replicate it, and so could you, I'm sure, many thousands of times.
Why do you think it's happening?
I think it's happening because people's needs for owning a piece of the action, for having a say in the future of the work that they're doing, for being felt important by the whole system, and they are being felt important when the job is given them to set these quality improvement goals. These needs for making a difference, these needs for having something to do with it, are the thing that are really causing them, I think, to want to achieve. They've set that target, therefore they've got to meet it. It hasn't been set. They aren't reacting like children or passive people to a control which comes down through the system, which has nothing in it for them. There is something in it for them. It's not more money, but it's a sense of achievement. Let me give another kind of an illustration which might describe this even more accurately. I don't know whether you know about paper machines, but they're organized, they're highly automated machines, and there are 4 or 5 major positions, and usually highly specialized skilled technicians operate these various positions. In a couple of experiments that I know about, there are the work has been organized in a quite different way. This would be an application of the theory Y assumptions for me. Each of the workers on this particular machine are trained in all of the jobs on the machine. Each of the workers have a lot of information about how the machine operates, what the requirements are, and so forth. They work an 8-hour shift, but there's an overlap, so there's a half hour where they're not actually on the machine. And that half hour is spent in a conference room, something like this one that we're in now, with perhaps a little less glamour in it. But they come in on a half hour before the shift, and I've sat in those meetings and listened to these hourly workers with no, or they're actually on an annual salary, which is another important factor, that they're just as important as the management. But I've listened to them talk about such things as, well, we'd better move around today and cover this particular thing because that valve went out on the first shift yesterday. So, Sam, why don't you cover that, and I'll take these 2 positions, and we can work it this way. Or somebody will say, gee, I think the company requires a particularly heavy output today. I think we really better watch this breakdown on this wet line because that's a big problem, and so forth. And these men are making the kinds of decisions that they have the information to make. They own that machine, and they're as proud as a volunteer fire department. And they're not making any more money than people down the street. They're making good money, and they're making an annual salary. But they're a highly motivated group. Their quality and their productivity are the highest in the whole company.
They're making a lot of decisions that ordinarily would have been made by management people, weren't they?
Under the old assumption that authority is what decides the competence to make decisions, rather than having the information, and rather than being the person who is close to the problem.
Both Warren Bennis and Dick Beckhard are professional behavioral scientists. Now let's turn to a professional manager who was a close associate of McGregor's, John Paul Jones, who is Vice President for Organization Development of Federated Department Stores, Incorporated.
I first met Doug at a seminar in Aspen, Colorado in the summer of 1959. At that time, I was searching for some principles to apply to management development, because it seemed to me that everything we'd done in the name of management development really hadn't accomplished very much. There wasn't any tie-in between what happened to people and the kinds of formalities they went through. There were about 15 of us at the conference, and we were sitting around a large table on the first morning. There were no lectures scheduled. Most of us from industry and business were a little puzzled as to what was going on. And Doug turned to us and he said something to this effect: I have the uneasy feeling that you businessmen are regarding me as an impractical, long-haired professor type. And he said, this doesn't fit my notion of myself. I wonder if we could talk about that.
Was he right?
Sure, he was right. We spent a fair amount of time denying that he was right, and then a fair amount of time owning up to our feelings. But this sort of opens a door to the kind of thing that Doug was so good at, the notion of openness and confrontation and expressing your feelings, treating one another, I guess, in a sense, as adults, not assuming of the other person that he can't share your feelings or share your thoughts.
Well, John, I know that in your job today, one of your responsibilities is for management development. Now, how have you been able to use McGregor's ideas there?
Not more than 6 or 8 months ago, I went through a division of Federated and talked to some of the promising young men whom they'd identified and asked me to talk with. And our approach today is to say, what do you need? What are your aspirations? What's been your experience? Where are the roadblocks? What kind of new knowledge would you like to acquire? What would you like the company to do? Have you thought about these kinds of things? Let's be clear that you can't do this unless you have management feeling along with you that the important thing, one of the most important things in growth is participation. Not having things done to you, not being sent out to get educated or to get fixed, which we so often do with training, but to be a participant, to have some control over your career and the things that happen to you. And I might add that this management did beautifully in supporting, being very supportive of what these people wanted to do. Interestingly enough, very little of this involves going away to courses. It usually means some new experience in the company. And occasionally going away, but not with the not with the sense of getting a piece of formal learning so much as interacting with people from other businesses and maybe learning how they do things, which is, of course, the side benefit of so many conferences.
Why did you do it that way, John?
Well, because the motivation which comes from genuine participation makes the real difference, as far as I'm concerned. It's the charge behind the man himself. People don't want things done to them. They don't like to be manipulated. I don't like it, and I argue that you don't, and most people don't. People have a constructive intent. They want to achieve, they want to do things, but they want to be part of it. And for many, many years in management, we have been assuming that people are passive, and the job is for us to develop them. Now we're working on the notion that it's better for them to have almost the major hand in this. We must be prepared to meet these needs. And I've never found the needs to be exorbitant, unusual to the point that the company couldn't do anything about them, so expensive that you couldn't possibly deal with them. Mostly it means some work on the part of the corporation. You have to find openings and opportunities, and you have to be willing to take risks with people in jobs in which they may not have had the experience that you might have thought they ought to have. Every time you take these risks, or almost every time, you're surprised and pleased way beyond your expectations.
John, I know that when McGregor was still alive and while you were with a different company, you worked directly with him. Can you give me an example of some of the work that the two of you did together?
Well, let's take one that illustrates a whole host of principles and in which Doug was involved, at both primarily as a strategist for us. We had 5 technological groups in a single geographic location containing roughly 800 engineers, reporting to 5 directors. And the directors worked for 3 different divisions of the corporation. Engineering work was slowing down. Costs were going up. There were great problems. We suggested a self-study, a sort of a bootstrap operation, because we felt that the engineering talent was there, but the methods of working with one another were probably blocked. Doug's principles underlay the whole project. Among them, the notion that people at the working level know the problems of that level best, whether they're chairman of the board or janitors. Number 2, the face-to-face work group tends to be the unit of diagnosis and change. 3, people will work hard for objectives, organizational changes, and other things to which they've become committed by genuine participation. 4, ingenuity, creativity are widely distributed through the population, not narrowly. And so we went down to the location and we interviewed 800 engineers.
Wow.
In groups. First in groups of 50 with the management, sharing the problem. It's either this or it's that. We either do lousy engineering work or we're not working right, but costs are going up, plants are behind schedule, and so forth. Backlogs are enormous. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask you to tell us what the roadblocks are. Tell us how engineering work could be done better among the 5 groups. And then we're going to take these data and we're going to feed them back to you to find out if they're accurate. We're going to take the same data with the 5 directors and work through some tentative solutions. Then we're going to come back to you and ask you to form task forces to look at these tentative solutions. All these, incidentally, were Doug's basic notions. And then we'll try and work through a change process.
But these changes were the group's own ideas and recommendations, not just something that your group recommended to them.
And this is the point about mutual trust. Before you can be a real catalyst in these things, you've got to feel this in a gut sense. You've got to be able to sit down as we do. Let's say we took a group of 10 engineers and said, look, what are really, we weren't using the word in those days, what's the hang up here? Well, they'll tell you. Most people will tell you when you ask. And there may be interpersonal difficulties. The plant people are stupid and we're smart, or vice versa. And I take things down to the plant and they say, throw it over the fence and don't bother me anymore. And the plant people say, those guys from the hill come down here and throw it over the fence, and we say, help, and they say, forget it, you're not important. These kinds of things.
What was the result of all those interviews?
Now, what happened was that manpower costs stayed relatively the same while the workload climbed very steeply. And backlogs, and I checked on some of these measurements the other day, backlogs of work were cut, some of them in 6 weeks, from as much as 50% to 5%. And what groups were saying is, look, our hang-up is not knowing how to do engineering. It's the inability to communicate across functional lines. We had design groups, we had plant building groups, we had process design groups, we had instrumentation people, all of whom tended to be focused on their little bit of the pie and not focused on the total problem. And it was possible to focus these people on the total problem of how do you do better engineering work? How do we learn to work in a very complex situation? How do we learn to form and reform teams and trust each other and get focused on the objective of getting this plant from the piece of paper through the pilot stage into production in a shorter time than we've ever been able to do it.
Well, that group was suffering from a pretty sizable, let's call it a productivity deficit, which was not due to anything wrong with its abilities as such, but just this difficulty of communicating effectively.
That's right.
How can you determine whether theory Y assumptions actually apply to specific individuals?
Doug's point was the only way you can confirm these assumptions is to make them and then treat people by these assumptions, that people do have the sense of responsibility. They do want to achieve. They are basically honest. They want to do a good job. They like to succeed. They like to see their organization succeed. They're not stupid. They're not gullible. And don't act as though they were. And that's the whole secret of applying Theory Y. Now, nobody does it perfectly. I don't do it perfectly. I wouldn't kid you. I have the same difficulties I'm sure other managers do. People are not passive. They are not stupid. They are not gullible. They are not lazy. They are not irresponsible. They tend to organize themselves. They are constructive. I make the same assumptions, or I try to, about other people that I make about myself, and then behave that way. And that's the whole secret of applying Theory Y.
Douglas McGregor devoted his entire adult life to studying the ways in which people actually behave in organizations. The more he studied, the more convinced he became of the perfectibility of man, that because men are capable of learning and profiting from their experience, they're also capable of contributing much higher levels of responsibility and effectiveness to the organizations in which they work. Once, in talking about the attempt to apply Theory Y to practical management problems, McGregor said that it was something like embarking upon a lifetime educational venture. Clearly, Douglas McGregor was embarked on a lifetime educational venture of his own. And managerial theory and managerial practice are both much the richer for it.